A black surgeon, Dr. Lillian Carter, renowned for her groundbreaking work and decades of saving lives, boards a flight home after receiving a prestigious award. But as she settles into her first-class seat, an unexpected confrontation unfolds. A prejudiced flight attendant begins questioning her legitimacy, and a passenger's racist remarks escalate the situation. Within minutes, the quiet dignity of Dr. Carter collides with unspoken bias, unraveling a chain of events that shocks everyone on board and sparks a national debate about race, resilience, and humanity. What happened next changed lives forever and became a story the world couldn't ignore. Stay with me, this is one you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you find this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe for more impactful narratives. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Lillian Carter's modest home, casting a golden glow on a room filled with silent witnesses to an extraordinary life. Books lined the walls, their spines creased from countless readings, while photographs framed in tarnished silver adorned the mantel. Each photo captured a moment of patient's joyful family, a young Lillian in her surgical scrubs, and, most prominently, an image of a young man with a radiant smile in a wheelchair. Above them hung a plaque, for distinguished service in medicine. At 72, Lillian had grown accustomed to moving through life unnoticed. Her hearing aids buzzed faintly as she adjusted them, hands still steady despite the creeping arthritis that had pushed her into retirement years ago. For decades, she had been one of the best, a surgeon whose precision saved countless lives. Yet now, her days were quieter, punctuated only by occasional visits from neighbors and the steady hum of the news radio she played while making her morning coffee. Today, however, was no ordinary day. As she folded a modest wardrobe into a well-worn suitcase, the radio host's voice caught her attention. The topic: discrimination in modern America. There have been strides, the voice declared, but let's not fool ourselves. Bias lives among us, woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. Lillian paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of a white blouse. She had heard it all before, the hopeful rhetoric and grim reality. Bias wasn't just an abstract concept, it was the sideways glances, the polite dismissals, and the loaded silences she had endured her entire life. She thought of the man in the wheelchair in the photo. She thought of the fire, the smoke, and the instincts that propelled her forward that night. The man she had saved didn't know her name then, and she'd made no effort to offer it later. To save lives was her duty, not an act for applause. Yet, this morning carried a strange weight. The day ahead was supposed to honor her a Lifetime Achievement Award at a prestigious medical conference in New York City. And while gratitude from peers was always welcome, Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that the day would hold more than she anticipated. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Dr. Carter? It was Claire, her neighbor, a bright-eyed college student who often helped Lillian with errands. She bounded into the room, a mix of energy and admiration. "Let me help with that," Claire said, reaching for the suitcase. Lillian smiled, allowing the young woman to assist. "Thank you, Claire. My hands aren't what they used to be." "You're still amazing, Dr. Carter," Claire said, her voice filled with awe. "A surgeon? That's incredible. I can only hope to achieve half of what you have." Lillian placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You'll achieve what's meant for you, Claire. It's not about how much you do. It's about doing what's right when it matters." Moments later, the taxi arrived. As Lillian settled into the backseat, the driver, a middle-aged white man, gave her a quick glance through the rearview mirror. "Where to?" he asked curtly. "Atlanta International Airport," Lillian replied. The driver grunted, muttering something under his breath. Lillian caught fragments. "These people, always thinking they're something special." Her grip on her handbag tightened. She had heard worse, endured worse, but this was casual. A quiet dismissal that could cut deeper than outright slurs. She met his eyes in the mirror, her voice steady. "It's an important day. I'd appreciate a smooth ride." The driver said nothing more, the tension thick as they navigated the Atlanta streets. As they approached the airport, Lillian handed him a generous tip, a quiet rebuke wrapped in grace. The terminal was a whirlwind of movement and sound. Yet Lillian navigated it with the precision of someone who had spent years finding calm amidst chaos. At the check-in counter, a young woman named Taylor Manning greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. First class? Taylor asked, her tone polite but laced with disbelief as she glanced over Lillian's ID and ticket. Yes, Lillian replied evenly, refusing to rise to the subtle bait. Taylor took her time processing the ticket, her fingers typing deliberately as if searching for something to justify her doubt. After a long pause, she finally handed it back. All set, Dr. Carter, she said, the brightness in her tone now overly exaggerated. Lillian offered a polite nod before moving toward security, where the process was no smoother. A TSA agent asked her to step aside for additional screening, his eyes narrowing on her hearing aids and the orthopedic shoes she wore. It's routine, he said. Lillian complied, her patience tested but intact. She noticed how others, younger and dressed in business attire, breezed through without pause. As the agent finished, she gathered her belongings and overheard a quiet voice beside her. Some things never change, said a woman with warm brown eyes, a stethoscope poking out of her bag. Lillian turned, meeting the knowing smile of Dr. Anita Patel, a fellow physician also traveling to New York for the conference. No, they don't, Lillian replied, her own smile tinged with both weariness and solidarity. The two women exchanged pleasantries before parting ways, and Lillian found herself standing at the gate. She chose a seat near an elderly couple, Frank and Louise Douglas, who were chatting animatedly. Their warm demeanor was a welcome respite from the tensions of the morning. You flying first class, too? Louise asked with a bright smile. Yes, Lillian said, her tone neutral but polite. Good for you, Frank said. We need more women like you up there. The compliment was unexpected but appreciated. Yet, as Lillian settled into her thoughts, she couldn't ignore the glances from others waiting to board. People who assessed her with fleeting skepticism, wondering why a black woman in plain clothing would be sitting in first class. When the gate agent called for boarding, Lillian rose, suitcase in tow. The moment felt heavier than it should have, as if she were about to step into not just a cabin but a confrontation. The quiet hum of the airport grew louder in her ears. The world wasn't always kind to women like her, but Lillian had spent her life meeting its unkindness with a resolve that never faltered. And as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she carried with her the weight of history, not just her own, but that of countless others who had walked this path before her. The jet bridge stretched out before Lillian Carter like a liminal space, a narrow passage bridging the noisy chaos of the terminal with the controlled order of the plane. Behind her, the faint murmur of passengers filled the air, their tones marked by impatience or anticipation. The elderly couple, Frank and Louise Douglas, offered her a friendly nod as they followed in the boarding queue. But Lillian felt the weight of other gazes, heavier and sharper, resting on her. Her first-class boarding pass, firmly gripped in her hand, seemed like a beacon that drew silent judgment. The cabin doors opened, and Lillian stepped inside. The first-class section was a sanctuary of understated luxury, its leather seats arranged with precision, the faint scent of citrus lingering in the air. As she approached her assigned seat, the atmosphere shifted, conversations softened to whispers, and eyes darted her way. At the front of the cabin stood Sophie Mitchell, the flight's lead attendant. Her polished uniform and tightly wound bun screamed professionalism, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation when they landed on Lillian. Sophie's smile, honed to perfection through years of service, faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Good afternoon, ma'am, Sophie said, her voice pleasant but noticeably forced. May I see your boarding pass? Lillian handed it over without a word, her calm expression masking the sting of such an unnecessary request. She had already shown her ticket twice, once at check-in and again at the gate. This was different. This was a test. Sophie scanned the ticket with a deliberate slowness, her eyes flicking up to Lillian and back down again, as though expecting to catch an error. A fraud, but the pass was legitimate, and Sophie had no choice but to hand it back. Right this way, Sophie said, her smile now tight. Lillian moved to her seat, her pace measured, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. As she settled into the wide leather chair, her hands smoothed over the armrests, a subtle gesture of grounding herself amidst the unspoken tension. Around her, the first-class passengers began to arrive. A businessman in a crisp suit, clutching a laptop bag, offered her a perfunctory nod but chose the seat furthest from hers. A younger woman with designer luggage gave Lillian a quick, dismissive glance before slipping into her seat and pulling out a silk eye mask. Sophie reappeared, her clipboard in hand, making her rounds. When she reached Lillian's row, she lingered. "Would you like a pre-flight drink, ma'am?" Sophie asked, her tone laced with a politeness that felt like a veneer. "Water, please," Lillian replied simply. Sophie nodded but hesitated, her gaze lingering on Lillian's modest handbag stowed beneath the seat. "Is that your only carry-on?" Sophie asked, her voice neutral but her question loaded. "Yes," Lillian said, her tone firm. "Of course," Sophie said, her eyes darting away, "just making sure everything is within compliance." The exchange drew the attention of Frank Douglas. Seated a row behind, he leaned toward his wife, his voice a whisper but audible enough. "What's her problem? The lady's done nothing wrong." Margaret nodded, her face a mask of disapproval. The tension escalated when Sophie returned with Lillian's water. Instead of handing it to her directly, Sophie placed it on the tray table with a mechanical precision, her body language stiff. As the plane began boarding the rest of the passengers, Lillian tried to focus on the view outside the window. The tarmac was a chaotic dance of baggage carts and ground crew, a stark contrast to the silent scrutiny she felt inside. The quiet moments didn't last. An older white man wearing a golf cap and a blazer entered the cabin. He glanced at Lillian, his brows furrowing slightly before he leaned toward Sophie. His voice was low, but the proximity made it clear he intended for her and others to hear. "Didn't know they were handing out first-class tickets like candy these days," he said with a chuckle. Sophie's lips twitched into a tight smile, and she didn't respond, but her silence was louder than words. Lillian's fingers curled around the edge of her armrest, her composure beginning to crack beneath the weight of the microaggressions stacking one on top of another. She wasn't a stranger to this coded language. The whispered remarks, the narrowing of eyes that spoke of disbelief in her place here. But no matter how many times she encountered it, the sting was fresh each time. As the cabin doors closed and the safety announcements began, the murmurs subsided, replaced by the hum of the engines revving to life. Lillian exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Then, just as the wheels lifted off the ground, Sophie returned to Lillian's row. "Dr. Carter," Sophie said, her voice sharper now, "I need to verify your ticket once more. It seems there's been some confusion in the manifest." The words hit like a slap. Lillian's breath caught, and for a moment, she was silent. Around her, the other passengers stirred, their curiosity piqued. "Confusion?" Lillian repeated, her voice measured but tinged with incredulity. "I've already shown my ticket 3 times. Sophie hesitated, her composure slipping as the weight of the passengers' stares pressed down on her. "It's just a formality," she said, her smile brittle. Lillian reached for her handbag, her movements slow and deliberate, the tremor in her hands betraying her frustration. She handed over the ticket, meeting Sophie's gaze with an unflinching steadiness. As Sophie examined the ticket, the whispers began again. The businessman with the laptop leaned toward the young woman with the designer luggage, their voices low but unmistakable. "Do you think she really belongs here?" "I don't know," the woman replied, her tone dripping with skepticism. Lillian heard every word. Sophie handed the ticket back, her face a mask of forced neutrality. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," she said stiffly before retreating down the aisle. Lillian sat back in her seat, her pulse racing. The cabin was silent again, but the air was charged, thick with unspoken judgment. This wasn't just a flight. It was a battlefield, and Lillian knew the fight was far from over. The plane had leveled off, cruising smoothly above the patchwork of clouds. The cabin lights dimmed for passenger comfort, and the attendants began their rounds, offering beverages and snacks. To an outsider, everything seemed calm, but for Lillian Carter, the tension was palpable, like a low hum beneath the polite exchanges and clinking of glasses. She could feel it, the weight of their gazes, the unspoken doubts, the murmurs that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Her ticket had been verified, her presence allowed, but the question still lingered in the air. What was she doing here? That quiet, persistent interrogation wasn't new, but it was exhausting all the same. Across the aisle, Frank and Louise Douglas watched her with a mix of concern and indignation. Louise, unable to contain herself any longer, leaned over and whispered, "Don't let them bother you, dear." You have every right to be here. Lillian offered a faint smile. Thank you, she said, her voice calm but tinged with weariness. I'm used to it. But no one should have to get used to it. Louise thought bitterly, her lips tightening. The quiet tension was broken by the return of Sophie Mitchell. Clipboard in hand, her demeanor had shifted, the veneer of professionalism now laced with an edge of frustration. She stopped at Lillian's row, her smile tight and brittle. Dr. Carter, Sophie began, her voice carrying a hint of forced civility. I noticed your bag earlier. I need to confirm it complies with weight regulations for carry-ons. Could you please place it on the aisle floor so I can inspect it? Lillian blinked, caught off guard by the sudden request. My bag is already stowed under the seat. She replied evenly. It's within regulations. Sophie's smile didn't waver, but her tone sharpened. I'll need to confirm that myself. It's standard procedure. The air in the cabin grew taut. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, some curious, others clearly uncomfortable. Frank Douglas leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. This is getting ridiculous. The lady has done everything you've asked. Leave her alone. Sophie turned to him, her smile faltering. Sir, I'm simply following protocol. Protocol, Frank muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. Funny how it only seems to apply to some of us. Lillian raised a hand, signaling for calm. She didn't want to escalate the situation, though every fiber of her being ached at the injustice of it. Slowly, she retrieved her bag and placed it in the aisle. Sophie crouched down, inspecting the bag as though it were a bomb threat. Her hands moved deliberately, unzipping a compartment to check its contents. Inside, she found a book, a neatly folded scarf, and a small case containing Lillian's medical papers and hearing aid supplies. Everything was meticulously organized, a testament to the woman who had once performed surgeries with unerring precision. There's nothing wrong with it, Sophie finally said, rising to her feet. Thank you for your cooperation. She moved away, leaving behind a silence that was both damning and suffocating. Lillian placed her bag back under the seat, her hands trembling slightly. Across the aisle, Louise reached out, her expression a mixture of sympathy and outrage. It's not right, Louise said softly. None of this is right. Lillian nodded but said nothing. She had spent her life confronting injustices far greater than this. But it didn't make these moments any easier to bear. The quiet dignity she wore like armor wasn't unshakable, it came at a cost. The unease in the cabin grew. Passengers whispered among themselves, some clearly supportive of Lillian, others retreating into silence. A businessman in a tailored suit leaned toward his seatmate, murmuring, "Why is she making such a fuss? Rules are rules." But it wasn't about rules. And everyone in that cabin knew it. The tension reached its peak when Captain David Sullivan, the plane's commanding officer, emerged from the cockpit. His presence immediately commanded attention, his tall frame and sharp uniform exuding authority. As he approached the first-class cabin, the passengers quieted, their whispers dissolving into an expectant hush. Sophie stepped forward to intercept him, her posture stiff. "Captain, I was just handling a minor issue with one of the passengers." Sullivan's sharp gaze flicked past her, landing on Lillian. His expression shifted a flicker of recognition, followed by something deeper. He moved toward her, his steps deliberate. "Dr. Carter?" he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Lillian looked up, her brow furrowing. The face was familiar, though the years had added lines and a touch of gray to his hair. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Do I know you?" Sullivan's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, his professionalism giving way to raw emotion. "You probably don't remember me. But I remember you. 20 years ago, on a highway outside Chicago. My car flipped, and it caught fire. You saved my life." The cabin fell utterly silent. The weight of his words settled over the passengers, their earlier judgments dissolving in the face of this revelation. Lillian's breath caught as the memory surfaced, a night lit by flames. The acrid smell of smoke, her hands moving with purpose to free a trapped man before the wreckage exploded. "I didn't think you would remember," she said softly. "How could I forget?" Sullivan said, his voice breaking. "You risked your life to save mine. I've thought about you every day since, wondering if I'd ever have the chance to thank you." The tension in the cabin broke like a dam. Passengers who had been skeptical moments before now looked at Lillian with awe. Even Sophie seemed to shrink under the weight of her actions, her earlier scrutiny now exposed for what it was. Sullivan turned to the rest of the cabin, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this woman didn't just save my life, she gave me a second chance. Whatever doubts anyone here might have had about her place in this cabin, let me make it clear, she belongs here. And we are all lucky to share this flight with her." A ripple of applause started, hesitant at first but quickly growing into a wave of admiration. Tears glistened in the eyes of some passengers. And even the businessman who had whispered earlier looked down, his face flushed with shame. Lillian, ever composed, nodded her thanks but kept her emotions tightly held. She had never sought recognition, never asked for thanks, but in this moment, surrounded by strangers who now saw her for who she truly was, she allowed herself a small smile. As Sullivan returned to the cockpit, Sophie approached Lillian once more, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Dr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I was wrong to question you." Lillian met her gaze, her voice calm but firm. "We all make mistakes. It's what we do after that matters." And with that, the cabin settled once more, though the air was forever changed. The turbulence they had faced was not in the sky but in their hearts, and it had left an indelible mark on them all. The applause had faded, but the reverberations lingered, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the first-class cabin. For a moment, Lillian Carter thought the tension might dissipate entirely. She sipped her water and looked out at the endless expanse of blue sky, her thoughts momentarily her own. Yet she knew better than to believe the battle was over. Some tensions don't simply disappear, they retreat, waiting to resurface. Across the aisle, Sophie Mitchell retreated to the galley, her composed facade beginning to crack. Her hands trembled as she adjusted a row of glasses, the familiar motions failing to soothe her. She could feel the weight of the passengers' disapproval and hear the echo of the captain's words, each one a quiet indictment of her behavior. But it wasn't guilt alone that gnawed at her, it was confusion. The dissonance between what she thought she knew and what she had just witnessed. How could someone she had dismissed so easily hold such a monumental story? The thought haunted her. Back in her seat, Lillian's calm demeanor belied the storm that churned within. She had lived her life refusing to let these moments define her. But the weight of them accumulated all the same. One glance, one comment, one unnecessary demand, it was death by 1,000 cuts. The kind of erosion that even the strongest resolve couldn't entirely withstand. She noticed the whispers beginning again, this time softer, less overt, but no less piercing. The businessman with the laptop leaned over to the younger woman in the designer scarf. "Unbelievable," he murmured. "She's the one who saved the captain. What are the odds?" The woman nodded, her eyes flicking to Lillian. "Still," she whispered, "it's just unexpected." The words were quiet but carried weight, the kind of weight that pressed down on Lillian like an invisible hand. She knew what they meant, what they weren't saying outright. It wasn't just her story that was unexpected. It was her presence, her existence in this space, her right to occupy it. The quiet dissonance soon escalated. As the attendants began to serve meals, a man in a navy blazer sitting 2 rows ahead called out. His voice was loud, firm, cutting through the hum of polite conversation. "Excuse me," he said, gesturing toward Sophie. "There's something off about this steak. Can I get a replacement?" Sophie approached, her movements quick but hesitant. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me take care of that for you." But the man wasn't finished. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze landing squarely on Lillian. His voice dropped, but not enough to hide his words. "First-class standards must be slipping," he said, smirking. "Just look at the company we're keeping." A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided looking in Lillian's direction altogether. But a few, the Douglases, a young woman in headphones, and a gray-haired man with a newspaper, stared at the man in thinly veiled disgust. Lillian heard the words clearly, though she refused to react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But inside, her anger flared, sharp and hot, cutting through the quiet dignity she had so carefully maintained. Louise Douglas wasn't as restrained. She leaned forward, her voice loud and clear. "Excuse me, sir, but I think you're out of line. This woman hasn't done a thing to you, and you have no business speaking about her that way." The man in the blazer turned, feigning surprise. "I was just making an observation," he said, his tone laced with mock innocence. "Well, here's an observation for you." Louise shot back, You're the only one here who seems to be lowering the tone." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. And for the first time, the man in the blazer seemed to falter. He muttered something under his breath and turned back to his meal. His shoulders stiff. Sophie, caught in the crossfire, looked between Lillian and the passengers, her expression a mix of embarrassment and unease. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice faltering. "No," Louise said bluntly, "but it will be if people start minding their own business." The rest of the flight was marked by a fragile silence, the kind that hums with unresolved tension. Lillian tried to focus on the book she had brought, but the words blurred on the page. Her mind churned, replaying the day's events, each slight and comment compounding the ache in her chest. When the attendant brought dessert, Sophie lingered at Lillian's row. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice low, "I wanted to apologize again. For earlier. I didn't mean to come across as." "As what?" Lillian interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. Sophie froze, her composure slipping entirely. "As disrespectful," she said finally. Lillian held her gaze, searching for sincerity. "Do you understand why it was disrespectful?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less firm. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "I think so," she said. "I made assumptions. I judged you without knowing you." Lillian exhaled slowly, her gaze softening. "It's not enough to realize it after the fact," she said. "You have to challenge those assumptions before they take root. Not just with me, but with everyone." Sophie nodded again, her expression earnest. "I'll try," she said. Lillian offered her a small, measured smile. "Trying is a start." As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin eased slightly, though it didn't disappear entirely. Lillian felt the weight of the journey pressing down on her, a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked to be tested, judged, or praised. All she had wanted was to reach her destination. But as the wheels touched the runway, Lillian realized that this flight had become something larger. It wasn't just her journey anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet struggles so many faced every day, the unspoken battles, the small acts of resistance, the courage it took to simply exist in a world that questioned your place at every turn. The applause that broke out upon landing felt different this time. It wasn't just relief at a safe arrival, it was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. Lillian closed her book, straightened her back, and prepared to face whatever came next. The cabin hummed with the faint noise of engines, passengers settling into their routines, laptops clicking, wine glasses clinking, quiet conversations murmuring like a low tide. For Lillian Carter, the stillness was deceptive, a calm before another inevitable storm. The scrutiny hadn't disappeared, it had only gone quiet, curling around her like an unwelcome shadow. Seated in her first-class chair, she adjusted the small scarf draped around her neck, a gesture that felt more like armor than comfort. Across the aisle, a man with a Bluetooth headset was deep in conversation. His voice, low but pointed, carried just enough to remind her of how she was often spoken about in third person. As though she weren't there. "Doesn't fit, does she?" he muttered, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The woman beside him, a younger, impeccably dressed professional, glanced at Lillian and shrugged. "Probably one of those lottery winners," she whispered back. "They don't belong here." Lillian didn't flinch. Years of enduring the unspoken and often spoken judgments had taught her how to absorb the sting without showing it. But absorbing wasn't the same as forgetting. And the words hung in the air, settling in like smoke. The flight attendants began their service. Sophie Mitchell moving methodically through the aisle, her polished professionalism restored after Captain Sullivan's earlier intervention. Yet as she approached Lillian's row, the air between them seemed heavier, fraught with something unsaid. "Would you care for dinner, Dr. Carter?" Sophie asked, her tone pleasant but hollow, as if overcorrecting for her earlier actions. "Just the chicken, thank you," Lillian replied evenly, her voice steady. As Sophie placed the tray down, she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Lillian's lap, where her hands rested. Lillian noticed but said nothing. The silence between them stretched long enough to draw a glance from the elderly couple behind her. Sophie finally straightened, a nervous energy in her movements. "If you need anything else," she added quickly, almost stumbling over the words, "please don't hesitate." Lillian gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Sophie moved on, But the tension lingered, an invisible thread pulling tighter. It was during the meal service that the next wave came. The man in the Bluetooth headset, emboldened by wine and a misplaced sense of entitlement, leaned towards Sophie as she passed by. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Are there any upgrades available for the rest of us? You know, to make up for the diversity of this cabin?" A few passengers gasped softly, their discomfort rippling through the space. Sophie froze, her professionalism faltering under the weight of the comment. She glanced toward Lillian, her expression unreadable, then back at the man. "Sir," Sophie began, her voice tight, "all our passengers in first class are here legitimately. I'd appreciate it if you kept your remarks respectful." The man raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Just asking a question," he said, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated ease. "Didn't realize it was such a sensitive topic." Lillian felt her chest tighten, the anger rising hot and sharp. But she remained still, her hands gripping the armrests as though to anchor herself. This wasn't new, but each instance chipped away at her carefully constructed resolve. Across the aisle, Frank Douglas couldn't hold back. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the murmurs. "You're embarrassing yourself." The man turned, his smirk replaced by a flash of irritation. "I was just making an observation. And it's an ugly one." Frank shot back. "Keep it to yourself." For a moment, the cabin hung in a fragile balance. The man's face reddened, but he said nothing further, muttering under his breath as he turned away. A faint ripple of approval passed through the nearby passengers, though the tension was far from gone. Lillian took a deep breath, willing herself to find the calm center she so often relied upon. She had endured far worse, but endurance didn't mean immunity. The weight of the stares, the whispered judgments, the overt disrespect, it all built like water against a dam, threatening to overflow. Her moment of reprieve didn't last. A commotion in the galley drew everyone's attention. Sophie, speaking in hushed but urgent tones with another attendant. Though Lillian couldn't hear the details, she could feel the shift in the room. Something was brewing, and she was certain it involved her. When Sophie returned, she approached with a clipboard in hand, her movements hesitant. Lillian watched her, bracing for what was to come. "Dr. Carter," Sophie began, her voice quieter now, as though trying to soften the blow of whatever she was about to say. "There's been a question about your ticket. I'll need to verify it again." A murmur swept through the cabin, louder this time. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Lillian felt the anger rise again, this time tinged with disbelief. She had already been questioned, scrutinized, and forced to prove herself repeatedly. How much more would they demand? "Is there a problem, Miss Mitchell?" Lillian asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Sophie hesitated, the color rising in her cheeks. "It's just an inconsistency in the manifest. I'm sure it's nothing." Lillian's eyes didn't waver. "I've shown my ticket more times than anyone else in this cabin. If there's an inconsistency, it isn't mine." Sophie's grip on the clipboard tightened. Behind her, Frank Douglas leaned forward again. "This is absurd," he said loudly. The captain himself vouched for her. "What more do you people need?" His words drew nods from a few nearby passengers. But others remained silent, their discomfort palpable. The younger woman with the designer scarf avoided eye contact, her focus fixed on her phone. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll check with the ground crew," she said finally, retreating down the aisle. The rest of the flight unfolded in uneasy silence. Lillian returned to her book, though the words blurred on the page. Around her, the atmosphere remained heavy, the earlier incident casting a long shadow. It wasn't until the plane began its descent that Captain Sullivan emerged again, his presence once more commanding attention. He approached Lillian directly, his expression earnest. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice steady, "I want to personally apologize for the way this flight has gone. You deserved better." Lillian looked up, her calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the weariness beneath. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly, "but I've learned not to expect better." The words hung in the air, a stark indictment not just of the flight but of a lifetime of navigating spaces that questioned her very right to exist within them. Sullivan nodded, his jaw tightening, and returned to the cockpit. As the plane touched down, the passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. But for Lillian, the journey wasn't over. The weight of what had transpired would follow her, just as it always did. The plane soared through the open sky, its engines humming a steady rhythm. Inside the first-class cabin, however, the air was anything but calm. Beneath the polished veneer of civility, an invisible thread of tension wove its way through the passengers, tightening with each passing moment. Lillian Carter, seated quietly by the window, could feel it pressing against her like an unwelcome guest. Her book lay open on her lap, but the words no longer held meaning. Instead, her mind replayed the events of the past hours, the stares, the whispers, and Sophie Mitchell's hollow apology. She had long since learned to navigate these moments, to shield herself with grace and quiet dignity. But grace, she knew, came with a cost. From across the aisle, Frank Douglas offered her a reassuring smile. His wife, Louise, whispered something under her breath, her expression set in a mixture of outrage and sympathy. Lillian appreciated their support, though she wished she didn't need it. The first crack in the uneasy peace came as the flight attendants began preparing for mid-flight service. Sophie moved through the aisle, her tray of drinks and snacks balanced expertly in her hands. When she reached Lillian's row, her polished smile faltered for the briefest moment. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice carefully measured, "would you care for anything?" Lillian met her gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Just water, thank you." Sophie nodded, placing the glass on Lillian's tray table with a precision that felt more performative than genuine. As she turned to leave, a voice from 2 rows ahead broke the silence. "Excuse me," the man in the navy blazer called out, his tone sharp. "I think you've got your priorities wrong. Some of us are still waiting for service." Sophie hesitated, caught between professionalism and the weight of his implied meaning. "I'll be with you shortly." "Sir," she said, her tone strained. The man leaned back in his seat, his voice loud enough for the cabin to hear. "First class used to mean something, didn't it? Standards are slipping." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident. Others shifted in their seats, choosing silence over confrontation. Lillian remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the storm beneath. The storm broke fully during the meal service. Sophie returned with Lillian's tray, her movements stiff and rehearsed. As she placed the meal before her, a commotion erupted from the other side of the aisle. The man in the blazer was standing now, his voice raised in indignation. "This steak is overcooked," he declared, holding the plate aloft like evidence in a trial. "Unacceptable." Sophie rushed to his side, her voice apologetic. "I'm so sorry, sir, let me replace it for you." But the man wasn't finished. His gaze flicked toward Lillian, and his tone took on an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "I guess you can't expect much when they let just anyone in here these days." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Frank Douglas shot out of his seat, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough," he barked, his voice reverberating through the space. "You owe her an apology." The man smirked, unfazed. "An apology? For what? Telling the truth?" Frank took a step forward, but Lillian's calm voice cut through the rising chaos. "Frank," she said, her tone steady, "it's not worth it." But Frank wasn't deterred. "It is worth it," he said, turning back to the man. "You've been spewing this nonsense since the moment we boarded. And I, for one, am sick of it." The cabin was electric now, the tension no longer simmering but boiling over. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some murmuring in agreement with Frank, others retreating into silence. The younger woman with the designer scarf glanced nervously at her phone, pretending to scroll through messages that didn't exist. Sophie, caught in the crossfire, looked as though she might crumble under the pressure. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "let's all remain calm." "Calm?" Louise Douglas said, her voice sharp. "Where was that advice earlier, when he was making snide comments at her expense?" Sophie's face reddened, but she said nothing. The man in the blazer sat back down, his expression smug but his posture stiff. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all in public. And then, as if the tension had summoned him, Captain David Sullivan appeared from the cockpit. His presence was immediate and commanding, his sharp uniform and steady stride cutting through the chaos like a knife. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Frank Douglas wasted no time. "This man," he said, pointing to the man in the blazer, has been harassing Dr. Carter since we took off. And frankly, the crew hasn't done enough to stop it." Sullivan's gaze swept the cabin. His expression unreadable. He turned to Lillian, his voice softening. "Dr. Carter, is this true?" Lillian hesitated, her calm exterior beginning to fray at the edges. She didn't want to make a scene. But the scene had already been made. "It's been a challenging flight," she said carefully. Sullivan nodded, his jaw tightening. He turned back to the man in the blazer. "Sir," he said, his tone icy, "I will not tolerate harassment of any kind on this flight. If I hear one more comment, you will be removed upon landing." The man opened his mouth to protest. But Sullivan silenced him with a look. "Do I make myself clear?" The man nodded reluctantly, his bravado finally faltering. "Crystal," he muttered. As Sullivan returned to the cockpit, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Lillian exhaled slowly, her hands unclenching from the armrests. Around her, the atmosphere had shifted, not resolved, but acknowledged. The whispers were quieter now, the stares less overt. Louise reached across the aisle, placing a gentle hand on Lillian's arm. "You're stronger than most of us," she said quietly, "but you shouldn't have to be." Lillian gave her a faint smile, gratitude mingling with exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, "but I've learned that strength isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's just necessary." As the plane began its descent, the first-class cabin felt heavier than it had at takeoff. The tension hadn't disappeared, it had only transformed, settling into a quiet understanding among those who had borne witness. For Lillian, the journey was far from over. But as the wheels touched down and the cabin erupted into polite applause, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, in the smallest of ways, the air had begun to change. As the plane descended toward its destination, the hum of the engines seemed to intensify, pressing against the ears of every passenger in the cabin. The atmosphere in first class was heavy, not with altitude or turbulence, but with the unspoken weight of what had unfolded. Lillian Carter, seated near the window, gazed out at the city lights below, her reflection a faint silhouette against the glass. She remained composed, as she always had, but her mind churned with thoughts she couldn't entirely silence. Around her, the passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Conversations were sparse, tentative, as though any word might reignite the tension that had flared only moments before. The man in the navy blazer had retreated into sullen silence, his earlier bravado extinguished by Captain Sullivan's reprimand. Yet the damage had been done, the questions lingering in the air like smoke. The flight attendants began their final rounds, collecting trash and securing the cabin for landing. Sophie Mitchell approached Lillian's row, her movements careful, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, perhaps shame. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in. "Dr. Carter," Sophie began, her voice low, "I want to apologize again for everything. I should have done more." Lillian turned to her, her expression unreadable. The apology was sincere enough, but sincerity didn't erase the earlier slights, the subtle ways Sophie had allowed the situation to escalate. "It's not just about doing more," Lillian said quietly. "It's about understanding why you didn't act sooner." Sophie blinked, the words striking her with a weight she hadn't anticipated. I guess I was afraid of making things worse." Lillian tilted her head slightly, studying the young woman. "And in doing nothing, what did you make better?" The question hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then stepped away. Her footsteps hurried as she moved down the aisle. As the plane began its final descent, the cabin lights dimmed, casting everything in a muted glow. Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to find a sense of calm. But her reprieve was short-lived. The man in the blazer, unable to let the moment pass without the last word, turned in his seat, his voice loud enough to cut through the quiet. "You know," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "some people just can't handle a little criticism. Always playing the victim." A sharp intake of breath echoed from Louise Douglas, her indignation boiling over. "The victim? The victim?" she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "You've done nothing but belittle this woman for hours. And now you have the audacity to paint her as the problem?" The man smirked, leaning back in his seat. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." "No," Frank Douglas interjected, his voice steady and firm. You're saying what you're thinking. Don't drag the rest of us into your mess. A ripple of agreement spread through the cabin. Quiet murmurs of support breaking the tension. Even the younger woman with the designer scarf, who had remained silent for most of the flight, glanced up and offered a tentative nod. The man's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking under the weight of the collective disapproval. For the first time, he seemed unsure, his bravado reduced to a flicker. Lillian, still seated, raised a hand. The gesture was small but commanding, and the cabin fell silent. She turned to face the man, her gaze steady, her voice calm but resolute. Enough, she said. You've made your point if you even had one to begin with. The man bristled, but Lillian didn't give him a chance to respond. You look at me, and you see someone who doesn't belong. You don't know me, but you've decided my place, my worth, based on nothing but your own assumptions. Her voice rose slightly, carrying an authority that silenced even the faintest murmurs. But your assumptions don't define me. They never have, and they never will. The cabin was utterly still. Even Sophie, standing near the galley, seemed frozen in place. Lillian's words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. I've spent my life facing men like you. Lillian continued, her tone unwavering. Men who think their privilege gives them power over others. But let me tell you something. True power isn't in belittling others. It's in lifting them up. And that's something you clearly know nothing about. The man's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a retort. But there was nothing he could say. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. A collective acknowledgement of Lillian's strength. The wheels touched down on the tarmac. The jolt of landing breaking the spell. The cabin erupted into polite applause. A routine gesture that felt oddly poignant in the wake of what had just transpired. Lillian leaned back in her seat, her composure intact but her heart heavy. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. One by one, they turned to Lillian, offering quiet words of support. Thank you, Frank Douglas said, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. For standing tall when others wouldn't. Louise nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're an inspiration. Even the younger woman with the designer scarf paused beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for not saying anything sooner. Lillian gave her a small, measured smile. It's never too late to do what's right. As she stepped off the plane, Lillian felt the weight of the journey settle over her. She had faced this before, and she would face it again. But in this moment, surrounded by strangers who had finally begun to see her for who she truly was, she allowed herself a flicker of hope. Sometimes, change begins with a single voice. And sometimes, that voice can ripple outward, touching lives in ways even she couldn't foresee. The jet bridge was a funnel of motion as passengers filed off the plane, their steps quickened by the promise of reaching their destinations. But for Lillian Carter, every step she took off Flight 327 felt weighted. As if the plane's oppressive air clung to her even now. She kept her head high, her gait steady, though she could feel the gazes of her fellow passengers, some apologetic, some filled with quiet admiration, and others, like the man in the navy blazer, simmering with wounded pride. As she entered the bustling terminal, the contrast was stark. The chatter and announcements, the clatter of luggage wheels, all blended into a symphony of anonymity. Here, she could disappear if she chose to. Yet the intensity of what had unfolded remained, like an aftertaste she couldn't quite shake. The Douglases caught up to her near the baggage claim, their faces still flushed from the confrontation in the cabin. Dr. Carter, Louise called out, her voice firm but warm. Can we speak with you for a moment? Lillian paused, her posture still radiating the quiet dignity that had carried her through the flight. Of course, she said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of weariness. Louise stepped forward, her eyes brimming with both gratitude and anger. I just want to say how much I admire your strength. You handled yourself with more grace than anyone had the right to expect. But it shouldn't have come to that. None of it should have happened. Frank nodded, his jaw set. The way that man spoke to you. The way the crew let it slide until it got out of hand, it's infuriating. It's wrong. Lillian offered them a small smile, her hands clasped in front of her. Thank you, both of you. Your support meant more than you know. But the truth is, this isn't new for me. It's not new for anyone who looks like me and dares to exist in spaces where we're not expected. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing against the small group. Louise's lips tightened, her indignation bubbling to the surface. "Well, it needs to stop," she said. "It's long past time for people to take a stand." As the Douglases lingered, a ripple of activity caught Lillian's attention. A crowd had begun to form near one of the arrival gates, their phones raised like an impromptu press corps. At first, she thought it was some celebrity citing a common enough occurrence in New York. But then she saw him. Captain David Sullivan, still in his uniform, striding purposefully toward her. His presence seemed to part the crowd. And as he approached, the murmurs grew louder. Lillian stiffened, her instincts urging her to retreat. She didn't like attention, she had never sought it. But there was no avoiding what was coming. "Dr. Carter," Sullivan said as he reached her, his voice carrying over the din. "May I have a word?" Lillian inclined her head, her expression guarded. "Captain." Sullivan hesitated, his normally commanding presence softened by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for saving my life all those years ago, but for what you did today. You showed more courage and composure than I think I've ever seen." Lillian's brow furrowed. "Captain, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I simply existed, and that seemed to be enough to provoke some." His face tightened, a mix of regret and determination. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? You shouldn't have had to endure any of it. I'm ashamed of what happened on my flight, and I'm committed to making sure it doesn't happen again." Before Lillian could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "Dr. Carter, can you tell us what happened on the flight?" The question was followed by a flurry of others, each one sharper than the last. "Did the airline treat you unfairly? What do you have to say to the passengers who stood up for you? Do you think this reflects a larger issue in society?" The questions came fast, like a tidal wave, and the crowd closed in, their cameras flashing, their voices insistent. Lillian felt her chest tighten, her carefully maintained calm beginning to waver. Sullivan stepped forward, his voice firm. "Please, give her some space." But the crowd wasn't so easily deterred. The questions continued, each one slicing through the air, demanding answers that Lillian wasn't ready or willing to give. Finally, she raised a hand, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough." The crowd fell silent, their eyes wide, their cameras still recording. Lillian took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "What happened on that flight is a reflection of something much larger," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "It's not just about one man's words or one crew member's actions. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the systems that allow those biases to flourish." Her gaze swept the crowd, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. "I didn't ask for this spotlight. I didn't ask to be a symbol. But if my story makes even one person really think about how they see the world and the people in it, then maybe this moment will have been worth it." The crowd was still, the only sound the faint clicking of cameras. Lillian turned back to Sullivan, her voice softening. "Captain, I appreciate your words, but change doesn't start with promises. It starts with action." Sullivan nodded, his expression solemn. "You have my word, Dr. Carter. Action is exactly what you'll see." As the crowd began to disperse, Lillian felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Sophie Mitchell, her face pale but determined. "Dr. Carter," Sophie said, her voice trembling, I don't even know where to begin. I failed you today. I let my fear and my assumptions get in the way of doing what was right." Lillian studied her for a long moment, the tension in Sophie's posture unmistakable. Acknowledging it as a start, she said finally, "But what matters is what you do next." Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll do better, I promise." As Lillian finally made her way to the exit, the weight of the day pressed against her like a tangible force. But amidst the exhaustion, she felt something else, a flicker of hope. Change, she knew, was never easy. It was slow, painful, and often came at great cost. But it was possible, and sometimes, it began with a single flight. The hotel lobby was a stark contrast to the chaos of the airport. The warm lighting, the soft murmur of conversation, and the polished marble floors all exuded a calm that Lillian Carter found deceptive. Beneath the veneer of tranquility, her mind churned, replaying the events of the day. She had faced confrontations before, endured the weight of unspoken prejudice countless times. But something about this day, the intensity, the public nature of it, felt heavier, more consequential. As she checked in, The receptionist greeted her with a bright, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, Dr. Carter," she said, glancing briefly at the computer screen. "Your room is ready. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Lillian nodded, taking the key card with a quiet, "Thank you." As she turned to leave, she caught sight of a cluster of people near the elevator bank, 2 reporters, their notepads poised, and a young woman with a camera slung around her neck. They didn't approach her, but their eyes followed her as she walked to the elevator, their curiosity palpable. Her room was perched on one of the upper floors, its large window offering a sprawling view of the city. The skyline twinkled in the fading light, a stark reminder of the world's indifference to individual struggles. For a moment, Lillian stood there, letting the silence wash over her, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders. But rest wouldn't come. The soft chime of her phone broke the stillness, and she glanced at the screen. Claire, her young neighbor, had sent a message. It was a link to a social media post, accompanied by a simple note: "You need to see this." Lillian hesitated before clicking the link. When the video loaded, her own face stared back at her, captured mid-speech in the cabin. The caption read, "A hero confronts prejudice at 30,000 feet." The clip showed her confronting the man in the navy blazer, her calm yet forceful words carrying an authority that silenced the room. The video had already gone viral, hundreds of thousands of views, comments pouring in by the second. Some were supportive. "This is the kind of courage we need in the world." Others were less kind. "She's just playing the victim card." Each comment, whether uplifting or scornful, carried its own weight, another layer to the burden she hadn't asked for. A knock at the door startled her. She crossed the room and opened it to find Captain David Sullivan standing there, his expression earnest. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice steady, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to check on you." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Captain," she said, closing the door behind him, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Sullivan offered a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I couldn't leave things as they were," he said, "not after what happened today." Lillian gestured to a chair, taking her own seat across from him. "You handled the situation as well as you could," she said, "better than most." Sullivan shook his head. "It's not enough," he said. "You shouldn't have had to endure any of it. And I can't stop thinking about how many others face the same thing, day in and day out, without anyone standing up for them." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lillian said nothing. Then, her voice calm but pointed, she replied, "Captain, the fact that you're thinking about it is a start. But the question is, what will you do with those thoughts?" Sullivan met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I can't let this moment pass without doing something. Change has to start somewhere." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, it was Sophie Mitchell, the young flight attendant whose hesitations and missteps had amplified the tensions on the flight. She stood in the hallway, her face pale, her hands clutching a small envelope. "Dr. Carter," Sophie began, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry to bother you. I needed to say something." Lillian studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Sophie hesitated, then entered the room, glancing nervously at Sullivan before turning her attention back to Lillian. She held out the envelope. "This is an apology," she said, "but I know words aren't enough. I made assumptions about you, and I didn't challenge them. I let my fear and my bias guide me. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Lillian took the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at Sophie, her gaze steady, acknowledging it as a step. She said, "But what matters is what you do moving forward. Will you speak up next time? Will you challenge those biases in yourself and others?" Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I will," she said, "I promise." After Sophie left, Sullivan stood to leave as well. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice softer now, "you've given a lot today, more than anyone should have to. I hope you know how much it meant. To me and to so many others." Lillian offered him a faint smile. "Captain," she said, "what I've done today won't matter unless it sparks something greater. Change doesn't come from one moment. It comes from what follows." Sullivan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then I hope this is the start of something bigger." As the door closed behind him, Lillian returned to the window, the city light stretching out before her. The weight of the day was still heavy, but in the quiet of the room, She felt a flicker of hope. The path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But perhaps, just perhaps, today had planted the seeds of something greater. The ripples were spreading, and for the first time in a long while, Lillian allowed herself to believe they might reach further than she ever imagined. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hotel's conference center, painting golden streaks across the bustling atrium. Lillian Carter stood to the side, watching as attendees arrived, their conversations weaving a low hum that filled the air. Doctors, researchers, and healthcare leaders from across the country were gathered here for the prestigious annual conference. Lillian had been invited to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, but as the events of the previous day lingered in her mind, the honor felt distant, almost hollow. She had not slept well. The viral video, the apologies, the overwhelming weight of the scrutiny, it had all settled into her bones, making her feel every one of her 72 years. Yet, as always, she straightened her back and walked forward. Strength wasn't about feeling unbreakable. It was about moving through the storm even when it threatened to undo you. The conference hall was a sea of round tables draped in white linen, each one adorned with centerpieces of carefully arranged flowers. Lillian found her seat near the stage, flanked by two young doctors who introduced themselves with eager smiles. They had seen the video, of course. Everyone had. "I just want to say," one of them, Dr. Kimberly Ellis, began, "how much your words on that flight meant to me. It's easy to talk about bias in an abstract way, but seeing someone confront it so directly." She shook her head, her voice faltering. It was powerful. Lillian offered a polite smile. "Thank you," she said, though the weight of being seen as a symbol felt heavier with each passing moment. The keynote speaker took the stage, his words a blend of optimism and urgency about the future of medicine. But as he spoke about the importance of equity in healthcare, Lillian couldn't help but notice the subtle irony in the room. Here were the supposed leaders of change, yet the unspoken hierarchies and biases that permeated their profession were as present as ever. She saw it in the way some attendees looked at her, respectful but distant, as though they couldn't quite reconcile her presence with their expectations of what excellence looked like. When the keynote concluded, a panel discussion began, and Lillian listened as speakers debated the future of healthcare. The topic of diversity came up, and one panelist, a well-known surgeon with an air of unshakable confidence, spoke with authority. "We've made incredible strides," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I believe the playing field is leveling. It's about merit now, not about labels." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. But Lillian's chest tightened. She raised her hand, her voice cutting through the room when the moderator called on her. "Dr. Harris," she began, her tone measured, "when you say the playing field is leveling, are you speaking from lived experience? Or from a vantage point that has always benefited you?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, and Dr. Harris' confident expression wavered for the briefest moment. "I'm speaking from data," he replied, though his tone was less certain now. "The numbers show progress." Lillian nodded slowly. "Numbers may show progress," she said, "but they don't tell the full story. Progress doesn't erase the biases that still exist, the ones that manifest in assumptions about who belongs in a space, who deserves to be heard, and who is allowed to succeed." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was utterly still. Then, a smattering of applause began, tentative at first, but growing stronger. Dr. Harris nodded, though his discomfort was palpable. The tension of the panel gave way to the lunch break, and as attendees mingled, many approached Lillian, their words a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Some wanted to thank her for speaking up, while others seemed eager to debate her, their questions laced with skepticism. One man, an older doctor with a sharp suit and an air of authority, cornered her near the buffet table. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice polite but firm, "don't you think focusing so much on bias risks undermining the concept of merit? Shouldn't we be encouraging people to rise above obstacles rather than dwelling on them?" Lillian met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Rising above obstacles," she said, "is something people like me have had to do every day of our lives. But the question isn't why we overcome, it's why those obstacles exist in the first place. And what responsibility those who benefit from the system have in dismantling them." The man blinked, taken aback, and Lillian turned away, her appetite gone. By the time the awards ceremony began, Lillian was exhausted. She sat quietly as names were called. Recipients walking to the stage to accept their plaques and give short speeches. Finally, her name echoed through the hall, followed by a wave of applause. As she approached the podium, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She wasn't just receiving an award, she was standing as a representative of every battle fought and every injustice endured. She gripped the edges of the podium, steadying herself. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "This award is an honor. But it is also a reminder. A reminder that excellence does not shield us from bias. That merit does not exempt us from prejudice." The room was silent, her words cutting through the polite applause that had preceded her. "I have spent my life fighting for others," she continued, "but too often, I have had to fight for myself as well. Not for recognition, but for the right to exist in spaces where I was not expected. Yesterday, I was reminded of how deeply those biases run, how they manifest not as overt hatred, but as whispers, as glances, as questions about belonging." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "We cannot afford to be complacent. Progress is not a destination, it is a process. And it is not the responsibility of the marginalized alone. It is the responsibility of all of us to confront the systems that uphold these inequities, to challenge the assumptions we carry, and to create a world where merit is truly the only measure." The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the walls. Yet as Lillian stepped down from the stage, she felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. The work was far from over. That evening, as she returned to her hotel room, Lillian sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, requests for interviews, comments from strangers moved by her words. She set the phone aside, her thoughts turning inward. The storm of the past 2 days had not passed, it had merely shifted. But in its wake, she could feel the beginnings of something new, a ripple, faint but persistent, moving outward. Change was slow, uneven, and often painful, but perhaps, just perhaps, the ground beneath her feet was starting to shift. And as the city pulsed below her, Lillian allowed herself a small, fleeting hope that the storm might not break her, but instead, clear the way for something better. The following morning, Lillian Carter awoke to the sound of her phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. At first, she ignored it, unwilling to let the world intrude on the brief reprieve of a quiet morning. But when the buzzing refused to relent, she reached for the device, her heart sinking as she saw the flood of notifications. The video from the flight had continued to spread overnight, moving beyond social media and into mainstream news. Headlines painted her as a symbol, a hero confronting systemic prejudice in real time. But beneath the glowing commentary were darker undercurrents, threads of skepticism, backlash, and vitriol. Anonymous accounts dissected her life with an unnerving level of scrutiny, questioning her credentials, her motives, her very presence in first class. Was she really a doctor? Or just another social justice warrior looking for attention? Playing the victim again. Why can't they just move on? This is what happens when you give them an inch. The words sliced through her, sharper than she cared to admit. For all her composure, all her years of enduring and overcoming, the relentless tide of judgment and hostility threatened to drown her. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. The conference agenda called for a panel discussion that morning. One Lillian had been invited to join at the last minute. The organizers had clearly hoped to capitalize on her newfound visibility. And though she had little interest in being a spectacle, she agreed. If her voice could reach those who needed to hear it, she would speak. The ballroom was packed, attendees filling every seat and spilling into the aisles. The moderator, a polished woman with a practiced smile, introduced the panelists one by one, saving Lillian for last. When her name was announced, the applause was loud but fractured, a few noticeable pockets of silence revealing the room's divisions. Lillian took her seat on the stage, her posture straight, her expression composed. She scanned the audience, noting the mix of curiosity, admiration, and skepticism on their faces. The weight of their expectations was suffocating, but she refused to let it show. The discussion began with the moderator posing questions to the panel, her tone light and conversational. But it wasn't long before the conversation turned to the video. "Dr. Carter," the moderator said, her voice carrying just a hint of intrigue, "your recent experience has sparked a nationwide conversation. Some see you as a symbol of resilience, while others have raised concerns about whether these incidents are being exaggerated. What's your response to those critics? Lillian took a breath, steadying herself. She knew this question was coming, and she had prepared for it. My experience is not unique, she began, her voice calm but firm. It is a reflection of what many people face every day in spoken biases, microaggressions, and the constant need to prove ourselves in spaces where we're not expected. She paused, letting her words sink in. To those who question the validity of these experiences, I would say this: listen, not just to me, but to the countless voices that have been dismissed, silenced, or ignored. Dismissing our experiences doesn't erase them, it only reinforces the systems that allow them to persist. The audience was silent for a moment, her words resonating like a bell toll, but the tension in the room was palpable, a current waiting to break. The rupture came from one of the other panelists, Dr. Charles Whitaker, a senior surgeon known for his sharp intellect and equally sharp tongue. His voice cut through the air, measured but unmistakably pointed. With all due respect, Dr. Carter, he said, I think it's dangerous to conflate individual experiences with systemic issues. We risk undermining the progress we've made by framing every incident as part of a larger narrative. Lillian turned to him, her expression calm but her eyes flashing with quiet defiance. Dr. Whitaker, she said, her voice steady, progress is not a shield against accountability. Yes, we've made strides, but those strides mean little if we use them as an excuse to ignore what remains broken. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. But isn't it also our responsibility to focus on solutions rather than dwelling on problems? We can't keep rehashing grievances without moving forward. Lillian's gaze didn't waver. Acknowledging a problem is not the same as dwelling on it, she replied, and moving forward doesn't mean leaving the truth behind. If we fail to address the roots of these issues, any progress we make is superficial at best. Her words sparked a ripple of murmurs through the audience, some nodding in agreement, others whispering to their neighbors. The tension between her and Whitaker was thick, an unspoken battle unfolding in front of everyone. As the discussion continued, the audience became more vocal. One attendee raised her hand, her voice quivering with emotion as she recounted her own experience of being overlooked and underestimated in her field. Another stood to challenge the notion of systemic bias, arguing that personal effort was enough to overcome any obstacle. The room became a microcosm of the larger conversation playing out across the country, a collision of perspectives, each one insisting on its own validity. Lillian listened intently, her calm demeanor masking the storm within. She had been here before, navigating these fraught discussions, trying to bridge divides that often felt unbridgeable. But today, the stakes felt higher, the room more charged. When the moderator gave her the final word, Lillian leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the weight of all she had endured. This isn't about blame, she said. It's about responsibility to see, to listen, and to act. Change doesn't come from waiting for the world to catch up. It comes from choosing to confront the uncomfortable truths, from refusing to let progress be a substitute for justice. Her words hung in the air, the silence that followed more powerful than any applause. After the panel, Lillian was swarmed by attendees, their reactions as varied as the comments during the discussion. Some thanked her, their eyes filled with gratitude. Others challenged her, their questions sharp and probing. Through it all, she remained composed, though each interaction left her feeling more drained. It wasn't until later, as she walked alone through the quiet corridors of the conference center, that the weight of it all finally caught up to her. She stopped near a window, looking out at the bustling city below. She thought of the storm she had faced, not just on the flight or in the ballroom, but throughout her life. The fight was unending, the challenges relentless, but so was her resolve. As the sunlight reflected off the glass, Lillian stood taller, her reflection meeting her gaze. The storm might rage on, but she would not be broken. Change, she knew, wasn't about grand gestures or immediate victories. It was about persistence, about standing firm even when the ground beneath you trembled. And so, she walked forward, her steps steady, the echoes of her words still resonating in the halls behind her. The final evening of the conference arrived, marked by a gala dinner in the grand ballroom. The room was a spectacle of elegant chandeliers casting a golden glow, tables adorned with crisp white linens and flickering candles. Lillian Carter stood near the entrance, her face calm as she observed the crowd mingling beneath the glittering lights. The tension of the previous days still lingered, but tonight, she was determined to reclaim her own narrative. She spotted familiar faces in the crowd: Captain Sullivan, talking animatedly with a small group, Dr. Kimberly Ellis, whose youthful energy was a sharp contrast to the weight of the event, and across the room, Dr. Charles Whitaker, his expression as composed as ever, though his eyes flickered with something sharper when they met hers. This was not a room filled with enemies, but neither was it entirely filled with allies. It was a battleground of ideas, of unspoken power, and of systemic inequities wrapped in polite conversation. Lillian took her seat at a table near the stage. She hadn't touched her phone all day, unwilling to face the relentless stream of notifications. The video from the flight was still making waves, fueling debates on news programs, op-eds, and social media. Her name was on everyone's lips, but not always for the reasons she wanted. For every message of support, there was another questioning her intentions, another accusing her of making everything about race. As she picked at her salad, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "May I sit here?" Lillian looked up to see Sophie Mitchell, the young flight attendant who had become an unwitting part of her story. Sophie's face was flushed, her hands clasping the back of the chair nervously. "Of course," Lillian said, gesturing for her to sit. Sophie lowered herself into the seat, her posture stiff. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted, her voice low, "but I wanted to thank you for how kind you were, even when I didn't deserve it." Lillian regarded her for a moment. "Kindness is not a matter of deserving," she said softly. "It's a choice, one we all have to make, even when it's hard." Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm trying to be better," she said. "I don't want to be the kind of person who stands by when something's wrong." Lillian offered her a small smile. "Then don't. It's that simple. And that hard." The dinner program began, with speeches from various dignitaries extolling the virtues of progress and innovation. But beneath the surface, Lillian could feel the currents of tension running through the room. This was a space that prided itself on advancement, yet its foundations were steeped in unspoken hierarchies. It was a microcosm of the world outside, a world that demanded perfection from those like her while excusing mediocrity from others. When the MC finally called her name, the room erupted in applause. Though it wasn't unanimous, Lillian rose slowly, her steps deliberate as she ascended the stage. The microphone stood before her like a challenge, its presence heavy with expectation. She began softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "When I was a young girl," she said, "I dreamed of becoming a doctor. Not because I wanted recognition or accolades, but because I believed in the power of healing. I believed that by saving lives, I could transcend the barriers that tried to confine me." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "But I quickly learned that the act of healing was not enough. Even as I worked to stitch bodies back together, the wounds of prejudice and inequality remained festering, unspoken, and often ignored." Her voice grew stronger, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "The events of the past few days have reminded me of something I've known all my life. Progress is not inevitable. It is not a straight line, and it is not guaranteed. It is fought for, inch by inch, often by those who are told they do not belong." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. But Lillian pressed on. "We gather here tonight to celebrate excellence, to honor the achievements of those who have pushed boundaries. But we must also ask ourselves, whose boundaries are we pushing? And who do we leave behind in the process?" The room was utterly still, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Even Dr. Whitaker, who had seemed untouchable during the panel, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lillian's voice softened, but her intensity remained. "Change does not come from comfort. It comes from confronting the truths we would rather ignore, from dismantling the systems that uphold inequity, and from challenging ourselves to see beyond our own experiences." She stepped back from the microphone, her final words echoing through the hall. "I don't stand here as a symbol. I stand here as a person flawed, resilient, and unwilling to settle for a world that tells me to be less than I am. And I ask the same of you." The applause was deafening, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the ballroom. But Lillian didn't bask in it. She nodded graciously, then returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in her lap. One by one, people approached her after the program, Some offered heartfelt thanks. Others shared their own stories of struggle and perseverance. But it was Dr. Whitaker's approach that surprised her most. "Dr. Carter," he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant, "your speech, it made me think. I don't agree with everything you said, but you've given me a lot to consider." Lillian met his gaze, her expression calm. "That's all I ask," she said simply. Later that night, as she stood by her hotel window once more, Lillian allowed herself a moment of reflection. The world outside continued to buzz with its own rhythms, indifferent to the battles fought within its walls. But she felt a sense of quiet resolve. The road ahead was long, and the storms would not cease. But she had planted seeds of thought, of discomfort, of change. And for the first time in a long while, she felt that the ripples she had created might grow into waves. With the city lights shimmering before her, Lillian Carter stood tall, unbroken, ready to face whatever came next. The morning after the gala, Lillian Carter found herself sitting in the corner of a cafe, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the city outside buzzed with its usual frenetic energy. She had carved out this small moment of solitude amid the whirlwind of the past few days. But even here, she couldn't escape the ripples of her presence. A couple at a nearby table whispered furtively. Glancing her way, one of them finally approached. A young woman with a nervous but determined expression. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm sorry to bother you. But I just wanted to thank you. Your words, they've made me think about things I've ignored for too long." Lillian looked up, her gaze steady but kind. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "The next is acting on it." The young woman nodded, her face alight with gratitude, and returned to her table. Lillian sighed softly. She appreciated the sentiment, but the weight of being a symbol was heavier than ever. She didn't seek these moments of recognition, they sought her. Unrelenting. The day took a sharp turn when her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, her instincts telling her this wasn't a simple courtesy call. "Dr. Carter," a man's voice said, smooth and official. "This is Alan Boyd, editor-in-chief at the New York Times. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Lillian frowned slightly, already wary. "What can I do for you, Mr. Boyd?" "I'd like to discuss the possibility of an interview," he said. "Your story has captured the nation's attention, and I think it's an opportunity to expand on the conversation you started." Lillian was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had spent decades quietly doing her work, avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. But now, the spotlight was unavoidable, and she knew what it meant to wield it: responsibility, scrutiny, and the risk of misrepresentation. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice firm but non-committal. By mid-afternoon, she found herself at the university where the final conference events were being held. She had agreed to participate in a smaller, more intimate discussion, a roundtable with students and young professionals, many of whom were from marginalized backgrounds. As she entered the room, she was struck by their energy, their hunger for change. The moderator introduced her, and the group leaned forward, hanging on her every word as she spoke about her journey. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told them about the barriers, the prejudices, and the exhaustion of constantly proving herself. But she also spoke about resilience, about finding purpose in the struggle. A young black woman raised her hand. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. "How do you keep going when it feels like nothing changes?" Lillian's chest tightened. She had asked herself that question countless times. "You remember why you started," she said. "You focus on the lives you've touched, the moments when your presence made a difference. Change is slow, sometimes painfully so, but it's built on those moments." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. Around the room, others mirrored her emotions, their faces reflecting a shared understanding of the burdens they carried. As the day wore on, Lillian's name continued to echo through the halls of the conference. The panel discussions, hallway conversations, and even casual remarks all seemed to orbit around her story. Some framed her as a trailblazer, others as a controversial figure stirring discomfort in a space that preferred polite progress. She overheard snippets of conversation as she moved through the venue. "She's brave, no doubt, but is she pushing too hard? Maybe it's not the right time for these kinds of conversations. She's exactly what we need right now, someone who won't let us look away." The contrasts were striking. The undercurrent of resistance as present as the admiration. But Lillian had long since learned that change was not about universal approval. It was about perseverance in the face of opposition. That evening, she returned to her hotel room, the city lights once again casting their glow through the window. She sat at the desk, staring at her phone, where Alan Boyd's number remained in her recent calls. The decision loomed before her: to stay within the confines of the work she had always known, or to step into the broader stage the world seemed to demand of her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Captain Sullivan standing there, his expression a mix of determination and apology. "Dr. Carter," he said, "I know it's late, but I had to see you." She stepped aside, allowing him in. "What's on your mind, Captain?" He hesitated, then said, "The airline has been reviewing the events of the flight. They're drafting an apology, implementing new training protocols, all the usual things, but it feels hollow. Like we're putting a band-aid on a much bigger wound." Lillian nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said, "but real change requires more than policies. It requires a shift in culture, in how people see and treat one another." Sullivan sighed. "I want to do more. I just don't know where to begin." "Begin with your own space," Lillian said. "Lead by example. Show your crew what it looks like to stand against bias. To create an environment where everyone feels valued. Change starts where you are." As the captain left, Lillian returned to the desk, her thoughts clearer now. She picked up her phone and dialed Alan Boyd's number. "Mr. Boyd," she said when he answered, "I'll do the interview, but on one condition: it has to focus on the systemic issues. Not just me. This can't be about one person's story. It has to be about the bigger picture." Boyd's voice was warm with approval. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." The night stretched on, but Lillian felt a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in days. The journey was far from over, but she had crossed a threshold, stepping fully into a role she hadn't sought but could no longer avoid. As she gazed out at the city, she thought of the young woman at the round table, of Captain Sullivan's uncertainty, of the countless people who carried burdens similar to hers. The road ahead would be steep and fraught with resistance, but she would walk it nonetheless, carrying the weight of her story and the hope that it might lighten the load for those who came after her. The air outside was crisp, the faint smell of rain lingering from an early morning shower. Lillian Carter stepped out of the car and adjusted her coat against the breeze, her eyes scanning the towering building before her. The offices of the New York Times loomed, their windows reflecting the gray sky above. Today was the day of the interview, and though she had spoken to countless audiences in her lifetime, this felt different. This felt monumental. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Claire, her young neighbor who had been following the unfolding story with wide-eyed wonder. "You've got this, Dr. Carter. The world needs to hear you." Lillian smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She wasn't sure about the world needing her, but she knew there was power in words, in stories, and she knew the cost of silence. Inside, she was greeted by Alan Boyd, a polished man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile. His handshake was firm, his eyes keenly observant. "Dr. Carter," he said warmly, "thank you for coming. We're honored to have you here." "Thank you for inviting me," Lillian replied, her tone polite but measured. She had learned long ago to reserve judgment until it was earned. They made their way to a glass-walled conference room where cameras had been set up. A small crew bustled about, adjusting lights and microphones. Lillian took her seat, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The interview began with soft, easy questions: her upbringing, her career as a surgeon, her early experiences with discrimination. Lillian answered thoughtfully, her voice steady, her words carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived the stories she told. But soon, the conversation turned to the flight, the viral video, and the firestorm of attention that followed. "Dr. Carter," Boyd said, leaning forward slightly, "the video of you confronting prejudice on that flight has sparked a nationwide debate. Some have called you a hero. Others have questioned whether these issues are as pervasive as they once were. What's your response to that?" Lillian took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "I've heard those questions all my life," she said. "People want to believe that because laws have changed, the world has changed, but laws don't change hearts. And they don't erase the biases that are ingrained in our systems, our institutions, and our daily interactions." Boyd nodded, encouraging her to continue. What happened on that flight wasn't extraordinary, she said. It was a reflection of the everyday struggles that people like me face, not just in moments of overt confrontation, but in the subtle ways we are questioned, diminished, and dismissed. It's exhausting, and it's relentless, but it's also invisible to those who don't experience it. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Boyd hesitated before asking his next question. What do you hope people take away from this moment? Lillian's expression softened, though her resolve remained. I hope they see that change doesn't happen by itself. It takes work, uncomfortable, unrelenting work. It takes acknowledging the ways we all contribute to these systems, whether through action or inaction. And it takes courage, not just from people like me who endure it, but from those who benefit from it, to stand up and say, enough. As the interview progressed, Boyd delved deeper, asking about the backlash, the support, and the pressure of being thrust into the national spotlight. Lillian answered each question with grace, but the weight of the conversation was undeniable. She felt like she was peeling back layers of herself, exposing the raw truths she had carried for decades. Do you ever feel like giving up? Boyd asked softly, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity. Lillian paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every day, she admitted, but then I think about the people who came before me, my mother, my grandmother, the generations who endured far worse so that I could have the opportunities I have. And I think about the young people coming after me, who are watching, who need to know that this fight is worth it. So, no, I don't give up. I can't. When the interview ended, the crew began packing up, their faces a mix of reverence and quiet reflection. Boyd shook her hand firmly, his expression unreadable for a moment before he said, "Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Carter. I think this will resonate deeply." Lillian nodded, her own emotions carefully contained. I hope it does. Outside the building, the air had grown colder, the clouds thick and low. As she waited for her car, a young man approached her, his face earnest and nervous. Dr. Carter, he said, his voice hesitant, I just wanted to say, thank you. My mom always said people like us had to work twice as hard just to be seen. And seeing you stand your ground like that, it means a lot. Lillian looked at him, her expression softening. What's your name? She asked. Marcus, he said. Marcus Powell. Well, Marcus, she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You have just as much right to be here as anyone else. He nodded, his eyes shining, and walked away, leaving Lillian alone once more. As her car pulled up, her phone buzzed with a new notification. She glanced at the screen and saw a news alert about the interview. An early excerpt had already been published, and it was spreading rapidly. The headline read, Dr. Lillian Carter, laws don't change hearts, but courage does. She set the phone down and leaned back in her seat, her mind drifting. The road ahead was still uncertain. The battle's far from over. But she had taken a step, and that step had created ripples. For the first time in days, a small smile played on her lips. Change might be slow, messy, and painful, but it was moving, and she would keep moving with it, carrying her story, her resilience, and her unyielding light into every space that needed it. The city blurred past her window as the car carried her forward. And Lillian Carter, unbroken and resolute, prepared herself for whatever came next.